much, Vishal. Okay, from my side as well. Welcome back to our forum. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And today we will have a talk titled Beyond Monohumanism, an Emerging Narrative from Latin America. But before I introduce Prof. Escobar, I just have two announcements. Number one, we finally have a website. So Vishnu or Phoebe will put the website link in the chat box and you can go ahead and check that out. You can see from the website, you will have the organizing team there, you will have the editorial team, and also all the speakers that we've had, their bios, their photographs, and also some access to the links to their talk. So all in one place. So I hope you enjoy, and yeah. So the second announcement, I will hand over to Prof. Antia to introduce the first volume in our book series.
Thanks a lot, Chanel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are very delighted that the first volume in this series of publications that will be arising from this forum is now out. Here is a very beautifully designed cover of the book with the title, Decolonial Voices, Language and Race. This very first volume has contributions by Kwesi Pra, Christopher Houghton, Monica Heller, and Bonnie McElney, Robbie Shilliam, John Bowie, and it's certainly a must read. Why is it a must read? I'll just read the endorsement from the blurb by two of our regulars, Christine Severo and Ashraf Abdelhay. Christine Severo writes, this collection of chapters and comments provides potent and polyphonic examples of how collaborative thinking may contribute to decolonizing our structures of knowledge production and dissemination. By focusing on global and common themes, this book opens up space for an ethical and political dialogue between the North and the South. It offers inspiring examples on how we can challenge the capitalist face of scholarship. Who wouldn't want to read a book like this? Just wait. Now, Ashraf writes, how sociolinguistics would look if it were conceptualized through Southern discourses is the running thread throughout not just this volume, but so far the entire decolonial series of the Global Forum from which the volume is derived. This book is a must read for scholars in both the North and South interested in the decolonizing of Northern sociolinguistics. Who wouldn't want to read a book like this? Now, so it's been published by Multilingual Matters, and there's a discount that's going on till the 15th of July. You can get a 50% discount. So currently it's going for £14 or $19 or 17 euros. But if you were to place an order between now and the 15th of July, you'd only be paying 50% of this amount. Thank you very much, Chanel.
Thank you so much, Prof. Antia, for that spirited advertisement. And now to the reason we are all here. I will now introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Arturo Escobar, to you. Arturo Escobar is an activist researcher from Cali, Colombia, working on territorial struggles against extractivism, post-developmentalist and post-capitalist transitions, and ontological design. He was professor of anthropology and political ecology at UNC Chapel Hill until 2018, and is currently affiliated with PhD programs in design and creation and in environmental sciences. Over the past 30 years, he has worked closely with Afro-descendant environmental and feminist organizations in Colombia. His most well-known book is Encountering Development, The Making and Unmaking of the Third World. His most recent books are Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds, 2018, Pluriversal Politics, The Real and the Possible, 2020, and designing relationally, making and restoring life with Mikhail Osterwal and Kriti Sharma that is forthcoming. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Escobar. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, everybody. Thanks so much, Chanel, for your presentation, the invitation. Thanks to Sin-Free, Vishna. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. Thanks to everybody in the Global Virtual Forum, the organizers. Congratulations on the first book coming out of the forum, which sounds really wonderful. And I'm pleased to be here in this seminar. And I was thinking that in terms of the organizing concept for this Global Virtual Forum on decoloniality and Southern epistemologies, I would like to focus on a level of, I guess, a level of analysis that is often invoked, particularly in Latin America, but that hasn't been given the attention that it deserves in terms of a development of this idea. And the concept is the concept of civilizational crisis, or what we could call civilizational narratives, going beyond the post-structuralist analysis of discourses of civilization and development, and capitalism and economy and so forth. And I believe that's a very important dimension that is being, again, focused on quite a bit in Latin America, and it's just beginning to be spelled out into the contrast between different civilizational narratives and how they are embedded in social life, in institutions, in practices, and so forth. So I do have a PowerPoint to share. The PowerPoint is a little bit long, so I'm going to be leaving out some slides to make it in about 35 minutes, beginning now. Just a second. Writing down the time. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen, and I look forward to the conversation and to Sin-Free's feedback. Okay, can you see my screen? Can somebody tell me? Okay, wonderful. So you're going to see where monohumanism comes from. Many of you are probably familiar with the term. I guess what I can say it now is from Sylvia Wynter, the wonderful, amazing Jamaican philosopher and feminist theorist. And what I like to focus most of my talk on is what I see, and not only me, I mean, this is a collective work, it's a collective process. Thought is always collective. As a narrative of life that is emerging in Latin America that contrasts really sharply with this, the narrative of monohumanism, the liberal, secular, Western bourgeois narrative of monohumanism. And I will begin with the idea that we are in the contemporary crisis, which is a crisis of climate, energy, poverty, inequality, food, and meaning. And the meaning part is very important. That we are in between stories. A story that is dying and multiple new stories that have been emerging in the context of that story that is in crisis. Then I'll talk a little bit about emergency as the difference between emergency and emergence, and how both the emergency, the planetary emergency, understood as a situation that is very serious, that is a threat to humanity and to the planet on the one hand, and emergence understood as something that is genuinely new, that is beginning to be born, how that might create new conditions for thinking, and then how that plays out in Latin America. Then, if I have time, but this will probably be the part that I leave out, is some questions in political ontology. Many of these ideas about narratives and civilizational narratives, the new take on that, stem or originate in the concern with ontology in social theory today. And finally, a very short conclusion. Okay, so to start, and I always like this, don't remember how to get rid of the bar at the top, but anyways, oops, and now we have another one. Okay, Sorry about that. That this saying by Gramsci, which is very well known, but it's made me think quite a bit lately. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And of course, we have the morbid symptoms of climate crisis, we have the war in Ukraine, we have increasing inequality in the world, and so forth. But it is a concern of many people today that this crisis is a terminal crisis in the civilizational project of modernity. Somebody like Thich Nhat Hanh, the very well revered Buddhist teacher, even says something very similar when he invites us to meditate on the death of this civilization. So there's a new way of thinking about crisis and about transitions that focuses on this civilizational dimension that recenters life and the human as the main concepts to be thought about today, to be rethought today, and much of that has to do as well with ontology, which is a provisional category. I think sooner or later we're going to go beyond Western philosophy itself to arrive at something that is more pluriversal in a way. So starting with this concept, what is the crisis about? And one of the best instantiations of the crisis that I have found in recent times is a concept of terricide, terricidio in Spanish, which was coined by the indigenous women for Buen Vivir in South America, originated in the Gualmapo, in the Mapuche territory in the southern part of the country, in what is called Patagonia. And these indigenous women define terricide not only as the killing of the physical ecosystems, but also the knowledge and spiritual ecosystems. And they called for building collectively worldwide a new civilizational matrix, summoned by the memory of the ancestors and the lands and landscapes that inhabit us. So it's the call of the earth in many ways. And it's the call on us, on everybody, to return to the earth from which we will find the source for new thoughts and new ideas. I like this formulation by Thomas Berry, North American priest, ecologist, and theologian. We are in between stories. The old story, the Judeo-Christian story, the capitalist story, the modern story, is no longer effective, yet we haven't yet learned a new story. So the old story has become a dysfunctional cosmology, is no longer the story of the earth, it's a sectarian story. And we see some of the markers of that story. We know, of course, that that story was very much connected to colonialism, capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade, the colonization and genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas and worldwide, the new infrastructures of progress and development. And but in more contemporary times, so the plantation was always at the very heart of modernity, of the modern project that we have today. That the face of terricide is also the monocultures of oil palm. There are monocultures in parts of Africa now, but from China, by China, that are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hectares. Sugar cane in my own region in Colombia, devastated ecologically and socially by monoculture of sugar cane for the past 200 years. And then how do we think about this emergence and emergency at the same time, and both at the social level? The emergency, of course, is the increasing inequality, the feminicides, hunger, malnutrition, poverty, and so forth. The emergence at the social level, what is emerging is the peoples and movements, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants in Latin America, are a new important force on the emergence of new ideas and new struggles. At the ecological level, the emergency is terricide, but what is emerging as a force is the earth itself. So the earth as the great emergent subject and subject of rights in many different ways. Epistemologically or epistemically, the emergency is the fact that we now see very clearly the limitations of modern thinking and modern theory, the fact that the way we think about the emergency and the way we treat emergency is itself part of the problem, part of the emergency. So the emergence at the epistemic level is precisely the epistemologies of the global south, the new ideas, the new epistemologies, the new knowledge systems that take place within the context of a living cosmos, not an inert universe, but a living cosmos. So thinking in terms of emergence and emergence takes us back to the question about the human. And I'll just refer to the very briefly, since most of you are probably familiar with Sylvia Wynter's work. It's a very difficult work, it's not easy. I'm aware of that. But Wynter, when she asked the questions of where are we now in civilizational terms, and she says that we are globally within, we are all trapped or contained within the monohumanist model or mode of being human that she defines as Western, bourgeois, secular, and liberal, and that is also patriarchal, obviously individualistic, rationalistic, etc., etc. And she traces the genealogy of that human, modern human, from the Renaissance on, and especially how it crystallized with the bioeconomic narratives of Darwinian's evolution understood in a limited way, and obviously the economic narrative of classical political economy, particularly Adam Smith and Ricardo, of man, so-called man with capital M, as competitive, and so forth. And then in the context of this, what Sylvia Wynter calls for is for it transcending this monohumanism, the horizon of monohumanism, and moving towards what she calls an ecumenical horizon of the hybrid human, the human that is both biology and narrative, that is both bios and mythos. So to retrieve the ability of the human to create new narratives and to create then new conversations and new beginnings for history. This we find as well in what I call from Moira Millán, who is one of the leaders of the South American movement against terricide and for buen vivir, for good living, as the emergence of new conditions for thinking. So Millán says, necesitamos una revolución del pensamiento. We need a revolution in thinking for the reconstitution of life. I also find a very similar idea in the Chinese philosopher Yu Hui, wonderful work, difficult work as well, when he says that in the conjunction between the triumph of modernity, the technological and economic triumph of modernity, and its meltdown, because modernity is also melting down, it's unraveling, even as it apparently succeeds, then we find the space for a new condition for thought and technology to move from a form of life centered on man, the figure of man, Foucault as well, obviously, an anthropocentric story, to an earth-centered story about life, an earth form of life, that gives us a new sense of historical mission. Okay, I'm just going to leave this out for now. And is there a new principle, an important principle for this transition between narratives of life? And in my mind, and this is again something that most of you are familiar with, what is emerging from these new narratives is the idea of interdependence. So if modernity was founded on these dualisms, on a dualist ontology and epistemology, an ontology that separates humans from non-humans, mind from body, reason from emotion, and so forth, then the new stories have to acknowledge the radical interdependence of everything that exists. It has to acknowledge the fact that we're not individuals as we imagine us to be, that we're not just only bios, not only body, that we're also earth and mountain and water and dreams and narratives and all these different things. So that relationality is emerging as a new foundation for life, as a way to reorganize our understanding of life and human and thinking. So relationality is emerging from multiple sources, from science, from social movements, from indigenous cosmovisions that become reactivated. Ailton Krenak in Brazil is an important example of that as well. And going beyond then those narratives, especially the narrative of a single human in a single world, a world that is made of a single world, capitalistic, patriarchal, etc., and what real. And beyond this current story of man, and recentering life and society and social policy on projects of making life, instead of outsourcing the making of life, because we have outsourced the making of life to corporations, to experts, to the state. Soy porque somos, and the picture of the wonderful Francia Marquez, who is the current vice president-elect of Colombia. Some of you might have heard about that. There's a new, very interesting progressive coalition in place in Colombia. It's going to be inaugurated next month. Francia Marquez, very charismatic, wonderful grassroots leader, has based her campaign on the Ubuntu principle of soy porque somos, I am because you are, I exist because all of you exist, which is another instantiation of relational philosophy. The political activation of relationality is what is going on today out of many of these narratives. That's at least the way in which we call it in Latin America. So the call is out, the call for other possible worlds. Otro mundo es posible, from the Porto Alegre Social Forum, a world where many worlds fit, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, or the Zapatista in Chiapas from 1994 on, that continued to be some of the main philosophers and activists of the pluriversal way of being and pluriversal way of seeing. Fuermaki calls for an ontology international in the context that of pluriversality, we can say. And then finally, to arrive at the main part of the talk, what is this new narrative then that is emerging in Latin America, and that I believe that is so different from the dominant narrative of secular liberalism and secular humanism linked to capitalism and patriarchy? Okay, just a second, please. So this is a narrative that is emerging, not from the academy, not just from intellectuals, but in the interface between social struggles and critical social theory. In that space for new conditions for critical social theory, for pensamiento crítico latinoamericano, Latin American critical thought, particularly from feminist, ethnic, and environmental movements, centered on the defense of life against extractivism. A lot of this has to do with the intensification of the extractive form of development, large-scale mining, agro-fuel plantations, mega development projects, etc., from neoliberal globalization, and rooted in a very different epistemology that has a relatively long tradition in Latin America, but that over the past 20 years is being rearticulated on the basis of concepts such as sentipensar, feeling thinking, corazonar, to reason from the heart, collective research and action, and a whole variety of militant research methodologies that is, again, originate in that interface. Many of these narratives are also anchored in the concept of interdependence. The new narrative is articulated in terms of 6 concepts. There could be many more, and each one of these concepts has other concepts associated with them. I'm just going to mention them first, and then I'm going to explain each one of them briefly before concluding. Okay, the concepts are territoriality, communality, autonomy, re-existence, pluriversal transitions or transitions to buen vivir, and the last one, which in many ways gathers all of the previous ones, is politics in the feminine. Politics in the feminine. They are concepts that originate against terricide, in the struggle against terricide, and for what we could call, following Fabiana Bussi-Bulaga and rearticulated by young Colombian philosopher Lina Alvarez, as a politics of the inhabited earth. I really like this concept. How do we recenter our thinking and our ways of being on the earth, on an episteme of a living cosmos that will be very different from the narrative from modernity. If we put side to side these two narratives that obviously don't exist separate from each other, they overlap, they co-produce each other, and especially realizing that the narrative in red, which is the dominant narrative of monohumanism, the story of man, the masculinist narrative, the narrative of global capitalism, of the heteropatriarchal capitalist, colonial, modern world system, the narrative of the individual and scarcity and the market and one truth, one rationality, one real. We put it side by side with the emerging narrative, which is a narrative that emphasizes that we are communal beings that exist on territories, that we struggle for our autonomy at the local level, and that we pursue beyond resistance, we pursue different forms of re-existing, and that we aim for progressive transitions, and then in doing that, we engage in a politics that is centered on the reproduction of life and the common as a whole, under the rubric of care, and not just on profit making and competition. Then we realize that these narratives are completely entangled with each other. And this entanglement between the narratives is very well seen, particularly in cases of environmental conflicts. For instance, conflicts over the destruction of rivers, forests, mountains, seas, the commons, knowledge, by extractive global capitalism. And many of these environmental conflicts are also ontological conflicts. Just to give you one very quick example, a struggle over a particular river in Colombia that was recently declared as being the subject of rights. The Atrato River in the Pacific Rainforest region, which is mostly an Afro-descendant and indigenous region. The local peoples articulated the defense of the river and the demand for the rights of the river on the basis of the inseparability of humans and the river. They always said, we are one with the river, we are one with mountains, we are one with the forest. We do not exist without the river. The river is a living being. The state, for the state, of course, that's nonsense. The state knows that the river is just water, it's H2O. At the most, it's an important ecosystem that needs to be preserved. But in the context of this struggle, there emerges what we are calling now with Marisol de la Cadena, pluriversal context zones. They are zones in which these narratives are entangled with each other, and that sometimes, from time to time, depending on the strength of the movement, they might arrive at a happy medium, so to speak, at a negotiated solution that we can discuss later on in the question and answer period. So this new narrative disrupts the continuity of man, and that the project of making the world one grounds struggles against extractive forms of capitalism, goes beyond the ontology of subjects and objects in emphasizing the communal aspects of life, the inseparability between humans and non-humans, and maybe gives the possibility of a different materialist social theory. We don't know yet how that's going to be. And just to explain one very quick thing about each one of the concepts, okay? In the 10 minutes or so that we have left for my formal presentation. So why territoriality? Territoriality is one of the most well-developed concepts in Latin American activist practice and social theory, critical social theory. The territory that is much more than land. The territory is the space where life and walls are constructed. That's why they are called and defended as territories of life and territories of difference. The territory understood in terms of the inseparability between humans and the territory with a very strong spiritual dimension. And the concept of cuerpo territorio, body territory, which is prominent in most Latin American feminisms, certainly indigenous and Black feminisms emphasize the continuity between the body and place and land and territory because the struggles to defend the territories, which are led by women oftentimes, are the struggles where the body is on the line. So that really it's impossible not to see the connection between the body and the territory. And the ideas about non-patriarchal and non-liberal and non-capitalist geographies of territorialities, which is also being worked on by Latin American feminists. Communality is a new term, talking about new languages. Comunalidad. Comunalidad didn't exist in Spanish. It was coined by indigenous intellectuals in Oaxaca, Mexico in the 70s, and it's being belabored, elaborated upon in different parts of the continent, to think nosotricamente, to think as a we, to self-govern comunalicraticamente, comunalicratically. In acknowledgement that to be human is to be communal, to be human is to be in the territory, to be human is part of being a we. So the emergence of a communitarian popular horizon, out of which the reweaving of the actual existing communities with all their power dynamics and all their partial destruction and devastation is taking place, recentering on collective autonomous production of life in the territories. Autonomía, again, like territoriality, and the Zapatista has been very important in this, but not only the Zapatista, is a very highly developed concept in Latin America today, especially autonomía, not at all in the sense of the individual autonomy that doesn't exist in the Latin American conceptualization, but autonomía as a new manner of enacting politics, autonomía as a way to regain the ability to make life more autonomously on the basis of sufficiency, mutuality, conviviality, self-determination. Indigenous struggles have been very important in this regard, like the one depicted here from the Cauca region. This is an indigenous, the Nassan struggle for the liberation of Mother Earth that has been going on, is going on right now as we speak. It's been going on for many years. And then again, to relocalize what is possible to relocalize. Not everything can be relocalized, obviously, but many things, especially concerning food, learning, healing, and dwelling, can be and needs to be relocalized. Autonomía as a practice of interexistence in the context of, even in the context of the ontological occupation and the physical occupation of the territories. Sorry. Re-existence. This is a fascinating concept originating in the southwest of Colombia and Ecuador as well, and it's a decolonial concept to convey the idea that particularly started with the Maroon experience of enslaved Africans who started to flee their plantations and mines in the Colombian Pacific region, in the Colombian Ecuadorian Pacific region, the rainforest region. That when they did that, they were not only resisting, but also creating dignified and viable ways of living in the forest, re-existing. So it's an ontopistemic concept that speaks about the ontopistemic dimension of resilience against ontological occupation. It responds to the question, what are we going to invent today to go on living, but also so to remain, to be who we are and who we want to be, while we also change. As the Zapatista put it, we are from before, but we are also new. So this is the spirit of re-existence, always invoking the context of ancestrality, but the ancestors and ancestrality as a contemporary force, as something that is very much alive, and that is a light in the struggles to be engaged in. Pluriversality and transitions. This is more well known to you, likely. So transitions to the pluriverse beyond the capitalist hydra, transitions to a world where many worlds fit, transitions beyond extractive development, post-extractivist transitions, transitions beyond post-extractivism, in the context of the confrontation between the communitarian entanglements, and the coalitions of transnational corporations. And there's quite a bit of narratives about transition worldwide. Transitions to the pluriverse in particular, and to extractivism, are very much being cultivated in Latin America and the Caribbean today. And the last one, politics in the feminine, which is a hugely important, comes from all Latin American feminisms, communitarian feminisms, indigenous Black feminisms, that emphasize that there cannot be decolonization without depatriarchalization and de-racialization of social relations. Seeing patriarchy as the most enduring ontology. It's an ontology that privileges hierarchy, control, negation of the others, appropriation, and ultimately violence and war. So against these patriarchal ontologies or epistemologies, there emerges a communal, popular, feminine form of politics centered on the defense of life, the reproduction of life, under the principle of care, under the paradigm of care. And wresting away the ability to make life from masculinist politics, masculinist political practices. So this that politics in the feminine that finds a very cogent articulation in this quote that I'm going to be reading from Rita Segato, one of the main feminist anthropologists working on this, that says that to opt for the relational path is to choose the historical project of being community, opposing the productivist, developmentalist, and exploitative project of things. The strategy from now on is feminine. So from the project of things to the project of links to the project of relationality. The strategy from now on is feminine. Sometimes this is understood as an essentialist statement. Believe me, it is not. It's a very well historicized anti-essentialist re-articulation of the feminine politics against masculinism as a politics against the project of death and domination and things that has become entrenched worldwide. These principles, these concepts, we can find them in a way embedded in strategies for transition. The ability to create new loops for making life beyond the toxic loops of the individual and the market and competition and so forth. So strategies for recommunalization of social life, the relocalization of many activities, the strengthening of autonomy at the local level, depatriarchalization, reintegration with the earth, and constructing meshworks among alternatives that are emerging in different parts of the world. Okay, this would be a whole different separate talk on how these strategies have been, in a way, placed around and implemented in many different parts of the world. But again, that would be for a different talk. Okay, since I am reaching the end of my time, I'm going to be leaving out this last part. We can introduce some of this in the conversation. It's about the politics of these ideas, the politics of transitioning between narratives, this idea of transitioning between narratives, the question of design and the cities. Does this apply to the cities? Well, of course it does apply to the cities. The cities have to be part of this rearticulation of different narratives about life. The question of technology, how do we deal with the seductive power of these technologies to shape our imagination of the future? Why is this question so important? And finally, some conclusion from Bayo Komolafi. I really love this idea that the way forward is awkward. It is awkward as in multiple beginnings, multiple histories, multiple new narratives. They will go wherever they need to go, wherever they can go, wherever we help them to go, those new narratives. And the fact that We are all designers and we're all design. And the need to interrupt that global project of fitting worlds into one. Design as a mindful and effective praxis, and politics as a mindful and effective practice of weaving and repairing the web of life, rediscovering the potential of acting from interdependence and care. Designing as mobilizing for new ways of dwelling on the earth. And I end with Moira Millán again. Nosotros no pedimos la propiedad de la tierra, nosotros proponemos otro arte de habitar en la tierra. We do not demand property over land. We propose a different art of inhabiting the earth or dwelling on the earth. Our struggle is for life. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And I hope that was sufficiently clear. A bit quick, but at least I can send to Siegfried and Chanel a recent paper where some of these ideas are already beginning to be crystallized, and they will be free to pass them on to the seminar list, if you wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo Escobar, for your incredibly interesting and short presentation. I could go on listening to the other slides that you skipped for another 45 minutes at least, but I will now invite Makoni to initiate the conversation with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Arturo. Let me begin by asking a very general question, and then we can see where the conversation goes. One of the crises that at least North America was faced with, or is still faced with, is the COVID-19 crisis. In what way, for example, what is the impact of some of the principles of care that you are talking about on how COVID-19 has been handled by indigenous communities in Colombia?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's an excellent question, Siegfried, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There was a saying, slogan, political slogan, and huge banners, sometimes displaying huge banners in Chile. In the most heated moments of the insurrection in Chile in October 2019, that said, no volveremos a la normalidad porque la normalidad era el problema. We shall not return to normality because normality was the problem to begin with.
Yes.
And that became even more prominent in 2020, during the uprisings in 2020 in Chile, in Colombia, and in other parts of Latin America at the heart of the pandemic. 2021, so 2021, the same slogan began to circulate all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
We can ask now whether that has been the case or not. Have we returned to normality? And most people will say, yes, we have returned to normality. And that's probably correct. But at the same time, we see more and more these wonderful ideas, these wonderful examples of local groups that in the vacuum left by the state and corporations because they couldn't occupy the space of people's spaces as effectively as before, they are re-emerged people's own ability to feed themselves, particularly to feed themselves and to take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there are stories of people's resilience and regeneration of their ways of being in the context of the pandemic. Some of them have been documented by the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Global Tapestry of Alternatives. You will find it easily on the internet under that name, which is an initiative that started mostly in India Ashish Kotari, some of you might know him, is one of the main people there. And Gustavo Esteva in Mexico, who passed away, unfortunately, a few months ago, and in Colombia as well. And so there is already an archive that is being built of stories about how people regain some of their autonomy over the making life in the context of the pandemic. Now, we can say that those are small experiments, and they are small, humble in different ways, which brings up the question of the politics of these transitions. Is a thinking of transition that is anchored on people's struggles and not at the level of the academy, not at the level of the state, not at the level of the great, even alternative left coalitions like Progressive International and so forth, or the Green New Deal, without saying that they are not important, because they do have a role to play. What is the politics of that? Of betting on what is emerging from below? And this, I think, to me, is a question, it's an open question in social theory and in activist practice, which is how does social change really happen? How does significant social change really happen? And what is a transformative alternative? What is a genuinely radically transformative alternative? One that is going to be resisting the attempts to being re-articulated into new rounds of global redevelopment. And again, this is something that is being discussed quite a bit today. I'm sure in your forum, in your global virtual forum of Decoloniality, it's one of the most pressing questions in critical social theory, I think, which is once we realize that the prescriptions of Marxism and post-structuralism, even important as they are, because we cannot abandon them, are not sufficient to illuminate significant real transformations there. Where do we go? And that's the more autonomy-centered set of discussions that emphasize local autonomies and then the rhizomatic meshwork type, network type of connections, horizontal connections across and among transformative alternatives regionally, nationally, and transnationally in different parts of the world. Again, the global tapestry of alternatives is centered on that. How do we foster convergence among networks of alternatives in different regions of the world? But there is about 6 or 8 projects going on global dialogues and convergences or in that sense. So I hope that give you an idea, simply of.
Yes, let me continue with this conversation, drawing from our own limited experience. I can see when I sit back why the tapestries of alternatives provides one with an opportunity to create and initiate change. But what I would like to hear from you, from your analytical experiences, how then do you sustain that change when the context that may have given rise to the change has dissipated? So the immediate practical context that gave rise to our forum is not exactly the same one that is prevailing now. So the question that I always ask myself is, what are the analytical principles that lead us to keep going and sustain change, even if the context is no longer the same?
Can you repeat the last part, Siegfried? If the context is not?
Even, for example, we started off by saying, oh, we wanted to meet because we couldn't fly and all things like that. The context, I mean, people can now fly, they can go to different places, but not everyone can do it in the same way. So what I'm trying to say is the context changes, but the question then becomes, how do you sustain change even if the reasons why you initiated the changes are no longer available, right? We started off with a forum because we wanted to meet to discuss, but then we discovered that, oh, it sounds like this is a productive way of proceeding. The question then becomes, how do we formulate our understanding of our own initiatives so that we can sustain a project over the long haul, right? In other words, how do we build in, to use your own terms, issues about transitioning from temporary initiatives to long-term projects? Yeah.
That's a huge question, Sinfri, and I hope others will jump into it with their own ideas. And so it's a question that in many ways has been asked in Colombia today by all progressive people who are trying to rethink the relation to the new government that's going to be coming into place. So it is a very progressive government, going to be maybe the first government in the world that is going to have a workable strategy for an energy transition, for instance, a transition beyond fossil fuels, which is going to be opposed by all kinds of different forces in Colombia and in the rest of the world. So how do we sustain it? And to me, and analytically, what are the tools that we have to sustain it? As you put it very well, once the conditions that provide an opening, so to speak, begin to phase out and begin to be reoccupied by reoccupied by what? And that's my first clue. Begin to be reoccupied again by monohumanism, by our attachment to individualistic ways of being, by our attachment to the commodity, by our attachment to consumption, which are individual but also collective attachments. They are civilizational attachments. By our being trapped in the toxic loops of existence, that always true constructors as individuals. This comes from Marx on, as individuals in need of commodities, in need to sell our labor force to exchange for commodities. But not only that, today is the belief, the delinking from place. I think the question of place and territory and community is super important. How do we maintain the attention? And how do we maintain active strategies for recommunalizing social life? Relocalizing the activities that we can relocalize. Food production is one of the most important ones, and many communities are focusing on that, even in urban areas. Produce food wherever you can produce food, to reconnect, to reintegrate with the earth, with natural world. So all of these have to be going on in the context, even in the context of the ontological occupation of our communities and our lives by monohumanism, by capitalist rationality, by instrumental rationality, by this seductive power of technology and our computers and our cell phones and our bodies colonized by those technologies. So it's a work that is a question that has many answers, I think, and that each group in every part of the world has to ask for themselves, what are the kinds of new ways that we need to reinvent? What are the how can we even rethink our cities to be cities proximity as somebody calls them now. This is from an Italian architect and designer. Cities, again, where we can reweave the territories of life in the city, we can reweave the communities, we can find what we need in proximity and not have to go, all over the place and all over the world to find what we need to survive. So I think what to me, analytically, sin-free is a new contribution of these ideas about the role of narratives, civilizational narratives like monohumanism. We know that from decolonial theory. From decolonial theory, we know that in a way, the enemy to be defeated is the heteropatriarchal, capitalist, colonial world system, whatever we want to call it. But that's helpful up to a point. Beyond that, we need to fill it in greater detail to connect it with our lives, daily lives, personally, collectively, communally. And one of the connecting points is precisely this concept that, for instance, monohumanism, the concept of relationality. How do we make real and tangible for us, for each one of us, the insights of relationality and interdependence? The instance that we have been pushed and made to live with the fiction of separation, with the fiction that humans are separate from non-humans, that we are separate from community, that we exist as these so-called autonomous individuals, which is nonsense. We know that is nonsense. We know that is nonsense from indigenous and African cosmologies. We know that is nonsense from the Muntu philosophy. We know that is nonsense from Buddhism. Buddhism is the most important theory of interdependence, centered precisely on the inexistence of the self, the inexistence of the ego. So there is a whole set of constellations that come in some ways through the door of ontology. But again, I say that's a provisional category. In Latin America, indigenous peoples talk about cosmovision. They talk about their cosmovision. Afro-descendants talk about their cosmovision as well. It's very sort of similar to ontology. So we've been using that concept of cosmovision. It's a vision of the world, but it's also a practice of the world. It's an enactment of a vision of the world, in particular ways of being communal, in particular ways of being local, in particular ways of struggling for autonomy, particular ways of struggling against patriarchy in the organizations themselves. And this is just one of the most important front of a struggle, the depatriarchalization of grassroots organizations going on in Latin America today, including indigenous organizations. So that's a whole set of things there. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me give over back to Rafael, because there are a couple of questions that are now in the chat room that he may want to follow up on. Rafael, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yes, I will start asking the question asked by Vishnya. And Vishnya wrote in the chat, a brief question. On behalf of one of our forum members studying in Ecuador right now, Magda Madani, I was curious as to what you make of the indigenous struggles happening in Ecuador at the moment. How might we see such struggles through the lenses or narratives you put forth? Thank you so much, Professor Escobar.
Great. Well, thanks for Magda, was it?
Vishnya
Magda
asked on behalf of Magda, yes.
Vishnya, my partner's name is Magda. And it's interesting because Magda is an unusual name in Latin America, and we realize that we're told that it has two different origins. One origin is in Eastern Europe, Poland, or in the Arab world. There are Majda or Majida in Lebanon and Egypt. Anyways, that was a quick parenthesis. But it's unusual, that's why I picked it up. So great question. And so there's a differentiation now that is becoming clear in Latin America, and maybe she will find it there in Ecuador, between Progressive governments, the first generation of progressive governments. Sorry, I hope the noise outside is not making it difficult for you to hear. Okay, great. There's quite a bit of noise outside now, and I didn't bring my headsets from the US. The progressive governments of the first phase that started with Hugo Chavez, 1998, ended in about 2015 with the end of the left in Bolivia and Ecuador for a time, and in other parts of Latin America, in Argentina, in Brazil, the coming back of the right. Now there is the beginning of a second generation progressive governance. The most promising examples so far are Chile with President Boric, 35-year-old young president that came out of the student movement, a very radical student movement, and Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez in Colombia, as I say, were just elected 2 weeks ago. So we're hoping that these second generation left governments, progressive governments, are going to avoid several huge pitfalls of the first generation. And they are the following. The first one is to base their development model on extractive development. So to engage in a post-extractivist transition to a different kind of economic model. I'll just leave it at that for now. Second, to be more attuned to and receptive to the demands from three groups: indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, both in Colombia and Ecuador in particular, environmentalists, ecologists, and feminists. In theory, the Constitution of Ecuador from 2006, Rafael Correa's constitution, included the rights of nature, but they were never implemented. The Ecuadorian, Bolivian, Argentinian, Brazilian, all of the left regimes of the first wave of progressive governments were profoundly extractivist. That meant that they were also anti-indigenous and anti-environmentalists and anti-feminists, because feminist environmentalists and indigenous peoples and Black peoples opposed extractive operations because they take place largely in their territories. So what we're seeing today in Ecuador is precisely, at least in part, a new wave of protests. Ecuador was one of the few countries in Latin America where indigenous movements have been so strong on and off that they have even been able to topple governments. I don't know if it will happen in this case. I haven't been following, and I'm sorry to say, I haven't been following because the Colombians scene right now is so intense that I haven't had the time to follow what's going on in Ecuador, beyond knowing that there are huge protests that had to do with very common causes. They imposed rules by the IMF for structural adjustment, increasing the price of gasoline and so forth on food. But this is the background. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sorry to say that I don't have more knowledge about it. There is a wonderful group, if Magda can connect with them, which is called Acción Ecológica in Quito, it's based in Quito. It's mostly a group of environmentalists, feminist environmentalists. And she sends me a message, an email message. I can send her the information to contact them. But taken as a whole, is one more instance of what is going on in the continent, the struggle that is going on in the continent, not only between the right and the left, but between different visions and forms of the left. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for writing in the chat box. There are many questions there. In this order, I have questions from Letzela Motang, Cristina Severo, Nibotre and Desmond Odugu. Then I will read the question asked by Letsele Motong. Thank you for the great presentation, Professor Escobar. I just wanted to ask, what are the ideological divergences or convergences between territoriality and situationality and positionality, particularly in the social theories?
Situationality and
positionality.
And positionality. Okay. Excellent question again. Just very brief answer for now, at least. Situationality and positionality are theoretical concepts, fundamentally theoretical concepts. They emerge from the academy. They emerge from the academy in the global north for the most part, not only, but for the most part, with feminist theory. Donna Haraway, obviously one of the main proponents of situationality, situationologies, hugely important concepts, hugely important contributions. Positionality, again, from post-structuralism. Territoriality is of a different kind. I think this new generation of concepts that are emerging more from below, like most of these narrative concepts that I emphasize. And I don't want to suggest that situationality and positionality didn't have anything to do with politics, because they did. They were very political at the same time. And they were linked to politics, for instance, ethnic studies politics, feminist politics in the US. But this is a different kind because they emerged out of collective processes, long-standing collective processes. Even if they have been emerging over the past 20 years or so, territoriality, communality, autonomy, and so forth, they emerge from living struggles that in some connection, not in isolation, obviously, some connection with the critical academy, and that in the context of Latin American intellectual political practice, which is always de facto situated. I think in Latin America, intellectuals always know that they are situated, that they are located, because they are held accountable by those people with whom they work about the knowledge they produce. And I don't know if Rafael or other Latin Americans who might be in the audience, I don't see very many Latin American sounding names, but if you agree with this, but to be an intellectual in Latin America, to be an activist in Latin America, in Brazil, oops, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we're still here.
Oh, okay, something happened with my screen. My screen went away. Somebody's coming in, maybe it's because of that.
I'm sorry, table hold.
Just a second.
Table hold, we can see your screen.
Okay, now it's coming back. Well, some of it is coming back. It's really. Yeah, there. Okay, great. Sorry for the interruption. It's perfectly okay. So to be an intellectual on the left in Latin America is to be situated. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect situation. We always hide our privileges. It's impossible to be fully out with all the privileges that we have, class, gender, race, sexuality privileges, but for the most part, that's the case. So these concepts are somewhat different because they stem from below, and they begin to find echo and to be worked collectively together with intellectuals that, some of them in the academy, but many of them not in the academy, even in NGOs and in social movements directly, begin to work within that, in that interface that I was describing, to come up with different ways of naming this struggle. So that's what I would say about that issue.
Thank you. Yes, and I agree with you with necessity or how we are compelled to situate ourselves as we try and produce knowledge coming from or being in Latin America. And I see other people from Latin America there. One of them was nodding her head as you spoke, so I think she agrees too. And I'm going to actually ask a set of questions asked by her. And this is Cristina Severo, who starts with, thanks a lot for this fascinating debate, Professor Escobar. Congratulations for Gustavo and France's victory in the election. Do you see a new stage for, it's a set of 3 questions, right? So I will start now. Do you see a new stage for expanding a decolonial political and social project in Latin America with new left-oriented governments? We really hope Lula will be the next one to be elected in Brazil in October. Yes. Also, how do you see the role of Black movements, such as in Brazil and Colombia, which received the largest African diaspora in colonial era, in decolonizing projects in Latin America? In other terms, what is the role of historical connections between Latin America and Africa in contemporary global struggles facing the civilization crisis? And finally, how do you see the role played by Amazon in international debates, disputes, and narratives regarding what counts as nature and life? Thank you.
Cristina is not making my life easy with these questions. They're wonderful questions. I'm not going to dare to say anything about Lula in front of Rafael and maybe Gabriel. I don't know if Gabriel is Brazilian or from other part of the Portuguese-speaking world, but you can talk about it, please. Be my guest. But it's hopeful also. Now the question is, I was saying that I wasn't going to say anything about Lula, but I'm going to say one thing. The big question mark about Lula is, will he be part of this, what is being called in Latin America now, the second generation, la segunda generación de progresismos, second generation progressive governments, or is he going to continue like the current Ecuadorian government to be part of the first extractivist wave of progressive governments? Okay. So I'm going to be tying the first 2 concerns that Cristina expressed. The first one about decoloniality in Latin America as an intellectual and political project. The second about, in the context of these new lefts, and about the role of Black people in Colombia and Brazil, and Colombia and Ecuador, I guess. I can speak about that in connection with the diaspora and especially with the motherland, with Africa, the African continent. And so the vice president is Francia Marquez. I actually do know Francia Marquez very well. I've known her for a long time. Genuine grassroots organizer, leader of a community, a small rural community in not far from the city of Cali, where I live. It's about an hour and a half south of Cali. A community of almost 100% Afro descendants with a very old existence in that territory from the mid-17th century, established by former enslaved people. There's a lot of gold mining in the area, still gold mining. She began her activism when she was about 15 years old against gold mining and against the deviation and the contamination of the river that crosses the community. She joined one of the main Black organizing groups in Colombia from a very young age. She's 40 years old now, 39 years old now. And she became very well known internationally because she won the Goldman Environmental Award for Latin America in 2018. And Francia began her campaign, and it has been one of the most incredible social facts in Colombia in a long, long, long time. She started the campaign to run as a president, and then joined the coalition with Gustavo Petro for the vice presidency. She started her campaign running on several slogans, and they were Soy porque somos, I am because you are, because we all are Ubuntu. So there's a connection there with Africa, even if it's a distant connection with Southern Africa. Second, we will maintain our struggle until dignity becomes a habit in this country, until dignity, because for Black people, for subaltern people, there is no dignity. There has never been dignity in the colonial context of, Latin American coloniality and colonial realities. And for poor people in Colombia in general. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's one of the more violent, one of the high degree of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. And the third concept that Francia Marquez has been running on her campaign is that her campaign, she's running for political office on behalf of the nadies, on behalf of the nobodies, on behalf of those, and this is a little bit like the pessimistic line of argumentation about the social death of Black people worldwide in the context of colonial regimes worldwide. So the nadies, so what she's working on, what she's playing on is the eruption, finally the eruption of those who cannot be, who cannot exist under modern ontologies, under the monohumanist model that Sylvia Winter talks about. Because under monohumanism, nobody who is different from secular bourgeois Western man really can fulfill her or his humanity completely. And that's the concept of social death as well. So on behalf of the nadies, the nobodies. So here we find that if there is going to be a chance, right now, I would even dare to say there's going to be a chance for any decolonial approach to society to be fostered at some level by a progressive government is going to be in Colombia now. And I say that with a lot of caution, because we all know that the state and capitalism not only are going to react strongly, capitalism against this, and global capital, and including the US, but also because, the state has never been the project of the state. The state is about colonization. The state is about occupying and not about decolonizing. But in a way, Francia Marquez is a decolonizing force. It's a decolonizing presence. Very briefly, the connection with the African continent, and that's one of the most important political strategies, alliances that can be pursued now, is to really foster greater connections between Afro-descendant intellectuals in Latin America and African intellectuals in Africa, and African struggles in Africa. There is very little, there is really very little. I don't know in the case of Brazil, but in the case of Spanish, and I think even English-speaking Caribbean, there is a much connection there that is active. It's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen, for instance, with some of the work that Achille Mbembe and Phil Winsar has been doing with the atelier in Senegal, in Saint Louis, Senegal, connecting more and more with African intellectuals in Latin America, and from people in Southern Africa, particularly around themes, South Africa in particular, urbanism and urban themes as well, what's happening in African cities, what's happening in Latin American cities. But so much more needs to be done in this respect. So thanks, Christina, for the question. And I don't know if, I would love to hear the Brazilians talk about Lula a little bit. It would be interesting for everybody.
Gabriel, would you like to, or Christina, go ahead, please.
We still have to get rid of something before thinking about Lula's progressive proposal, because Bolsonaro is really making things are really hard and difficult to face here. So we just have to get you together and get free from him, get rid of him. And things are not so easy on that. Thanks a lot for
not so easy. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, probably they are going to raise armed movements during the elections, the polls in Brazil. And so we face issues concerning elections, because we know that Lula probably will be the next president, but we don't know they are ready to prepare an attack against democracy again. But now with armed militia squads alongside with Bolsonaro military, etc. So we don't know.
Yes, Lula's life is really under risk. So we have to be really careful this time.
That's exactly the case in Colombia, where Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez have been threatened. Believe it or not, but this is Latin America. Francia Marquez has to go around like with 8 bodyguards all the time, and Petro probably more. And Álvaro Uribe, the former president, very right-wing, awful, fascistic kind of president, still today goes around with like 10, 15 bodyguards anywhere he goes. But that's the political life in Colombia.
Rafael, just a second, because there's something about Lula that's very important to remark here in the presence of Professor Arturo, is that Black movement and Black populations in Brazil increasingly, even in the last election we had this event, the same number. Black populations are the number proportionately the number of the population that more vote for Lula in leftist organizations in Brazil. But of course, this is not a guarantee for nothing, because Black populations are under risk. So Lula is facing the same risk that Black populations have every day in Brazil. So this is very interesting, because this is the risk of democracy that concerns the risk of every Black people, Black person in Brazil, in Black populations especially.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you. Yes, and not to mention what happened almost 4 years ago with the assassination of Marielle Franco, the municipal councillor of Rio de Janeiro, who was assassinated precisely because of her progressive political views, a feminist, lesbian, Black woman from. So, yes, and to date, those who asked for the crime to happen, those behind, they haven't found out who made it. So it is really concerning. Yes, we still have a couple of people who wrote either directly to me or open messages in the chat. And the next one up is Ni Botchway, and I would like to invite Ni to make a statement or ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Rafael. Thanks for the invite to the forum. Actually, I was invited by a colleague of mine, Chanel, at the Nelson Mandela University. So thanks, Chanel, and thanks, Prof, for your presentation. I'm a designer by background, and so your designs for the Pluriverse is a book that I've been recommending to a lot of people to read, especially designers. I think mine is more of a comment, especially starting off with the image that you showed of the planet going up in flames, you know, and it kind of like made me think of that album that Jamiroquai came out with back in 1993. I'm showing my age here a bit, called Emergency on Planet Earth, you know, and the notion that, you know, I was talking to Chanel on the side about how the world is in a state of chaos right now. And I was thinking around this notion of the world, you know, because you said something in your statement, answering a question just before mine, that, you know, there's never been any dignity for African people. And you could extrapolate that to people of the global South, you know, indigenous communities in this system. And this notion of the world got me thinking, and I was like, what world are we exactly talking about that's going up in flames right now? Because I mean, I could make the contention that my world has been in flames for the past 500 years as an African person. So when we are seeing what's happening, and, you know, the West is now kind of losing their minds, I'm like, the hole that you dug for the rest of us to fall in, you have fallen into yourselves, right? So I just want to show you something. So with this whole invasion, or whatever, air quotes, of Ukraine by Russia, there was this thing going around how the world stands with Ukraine. There was a tweet going around, you know, and one of the African news wires picked it up and showed that world, air quotes, when you look at the world population and those who stood with Ukraine, it was basically just the global North European Anglo-Saxon bloc. So when we talk about the world, that's what we're actually really talking about. Because truth be told, we've never been part of the world, right? And so I think what's happening with Ukraine and how the narrative of the world stands with Ukraine, because when you look at what's happening, the African Union, the Asians, a couple of the Latin Americans, I mean, you guys know better than I do, have not kind of like, you know, gotten into the corner of what the narrative is, but the narrative is being pushed about the world standing with Ukraine, or the world is going up in flames. And I think that's what I was just thinking about. What world are we talking about? Because our worlds have been going up in flames for the past 500 years. We're living in that hell. We've been living in that hell. So now that hell has now come to you, i.e. the West, right? The hell that the West made for the rest of us, now they are feeling that hell. And so it's like, you know, in life, they say you reap what you sow, ultimately. And the world, air quotes, is reaping what it sowed for the past 500 years. So that's just a statement I wanted to make. We get lost in all these, you know, words and things, and it's like, for me, my people have been living in hell. We've been living in hell. So what's happening in the world, air quotes, is like, which world are we talking about? I hope, yeah, it's just a statement that I just wanted to share to kind of not balance, but give a bigger picture of kind of like, yeah, these notions. And for me, it's kind of like the system we're in right now is like, it's eating its tail. It's like a snake eating its tail. It's the logical conclusion of everything that's been put into place for the past 500 years. And so, as I say, the best picture that I have in my mind, I'm a visual person, is that you lay a trap for someone, you dig a hole for someone for them to fall into. And now you have fallen into that hole that you dug for the rest of us, right? Anyway, that's just my comment. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Ni. That was a super eloquent comment with which I fully agree. And I know it was a comment, but if you allow me, I'll make a brief comment.
Please.
On it. And let's start with dating myself even more. I'm pretty sure I'm older than you, Ni. Well, I don't know. Another album, 1984, Outcry, I just put it in the chat, by Rastafarian Jamaican poet Mutabaruka. I don't think anybody knows him now, but amazing singer and poet. And this album begins with Mutabaruka reciting, less than 60 seconds long. The main line says, "You asked me if I have ever been to prison. Been to prison? Quotation mark. Your world of murderers and thieves, of hatred and jealousy, of death. And you ask me if I have ever been to prison? And I answer, yes, I'm still there trying to escape." It's amazing. I mean, it's really, really powerful. An outcry, of course, the outcry is that. It's the prison as an ontopistemic prison. It's not just about physical confinement. It's about ontological confinement, if you wish. At the same time, there's a lot of struggle that has been going on within that prison. And which is, to continue with the theme of the songs, I always like to use music and paintings as well. From Bob Marley, Babylon System, he says, this line I'm sure you all know: "We refuse to be what you wanted us to be. We are who we are, and that's the way it's going to be." And then again, you know, it's the rise of, at least to speak about Latin America, the rising up of Black peoples in Latin America, who have been one of the most important social, political, and ontological facts in the continent over the past 30 years or so. The new Afro-descendant identities that have been emerging in Latin America are very important in that respect. But a quick thing about Ukraine, of course, I mean, you're absolutely right. And is really telling how the world, who is the world and who is the human again. The human is no longer a self-evident category, neither is the world. Who is the world that is coming to the rescue of Ukraine, but cannot come to the rescue even to put in those terms, conventional terms, of people in the Sahel who have been facing famines and different emergencies, or even people in Afghanistan. They destroyed Afghanistan, and now Afghanistan is, half the population is in threat of dying of hunger, completely abandoned by the so-called civilized world.
Thank you, Ni, and thank you, Arturo, for the conversation and the music references. We're reaching the end of the first 90 minutes of our conversation, but there is still one question from Desmond Odugu, who wrote, "I have two related questions about whether the decolonial project of reconstituting life is a prescriptive or descriptive one, and what the role of the nation state can be in that project, considering the history of the nation state." I can elaborate on this, Desmond offered. Desmond, would you like to elaborate in a short way, so then we keep on time? Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Rafael, and thanks, Professor Escobar. Thank you particularly for the many interventions and words you've shared with us. I think encountering your work many years ago has been some bit of a life-giving force. So thank you for that. And I believe that I speak for many people as well. Before I make that brief comment, as we have this conversation, I'm sort of inspired. I wish, and this is perhaps to Simfrey, I wish we'll have an opportunity where this global forum can transition into opportunities for us to physically encounter some of the spaces we talk about. Just talking about Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil. I think of my brothers and sisters who are descendants of those who were taken from my neighborhood, just to be sure that we can look each other in the face and recognize that we all are facing the same struggles from our different localities. But to get to my question, So I live and work in the United States, but I started this journey in Nigeria, in the southeastern part of what is called Nigeria today. And I mentioned that because, you know, in the conversations that we have about decoloniality broadly as a project, I think it's fairly clear that one of the major departures from earlier struggles is this recognition that it's a grassroots project, that this is the people's movement in many ways. And I take that very seriously because I think for anyone who takes this serious, it decenters your position from, you know, within the academia primarily to recognizing the politics of social theories. And I think it's to that politics that I'm really more into or more committed to. But when I think of the ways that people, the indigenous people, the grassroots are wrestling with this, I feel both hopeful and concerned. And I'll give you a brief anecdote. A couple of years ago, culminating in 2020, there was this upsurge of demonstrations in Nigeria against police violence. Nigeria has a national state. For those who followed this was tagged the End SARS movement. SARS is a police unit that was supposed to fight crime, but it just started terrorizing people, as the police often do. And when people came out to protest in one incident, the government sent out additional military and police missionaries to shoot people openly and killed quite a number of people and dispersed that effort. And right now, Nigeria is preparing for a presidential election. And there are people who are warming up to find ways to get that grassroots voice into national politics. But there also seems to me as many people who are trying to maintain the establishment, as people from the same grassroots, who have bought into the logic of their own exploitation. My apologies, I have those I'm primarily devoted to. Just one second. So the point then I'm trying to, the question I'm asking myself then is, there's certainly a descriptive element to the project of decoloniality. That is the fact that this is coming from people. So this is not just people from the academia speaking and preaching. But I also think that there are a lot of people for whom this does not make sense. People who, I think when you said earlier, referencing our friend Samakers, that, the struggle will continue until dignity becomes a habit for this country. I think for some people, dignity has been understood as Westernization, right? They have bought into the idea that the only way to live a dignified life is to buy into that life of individual mass consumption. And it begins to point to the possibilities of a prescriptive dimension to the idea of decoloniality. And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, especially the ways that people in academia have a role to play here. How do you balance those roles? Now, to the question about the nation state, I'm going to make this point very quickly. To talk about the Colombia, development, which I think most of us are excited about. I almost always get excited when I see that, right? But I'm also always very concerned about the institutions of the nation state and its history as an institution that is primed to deploy violence to maintain itself and its institutions and those who work within it. So I've always wondered about how hopeful one can be about the possibility to transform the institutions of the nation state itself, especially recognizing that those who are elected into those offices stay there only for a couple of years. Look at the US, the result we got from having Obama in office for 8 years is Trump, right? So it's not like we just have that one single movement and then things get better from there. I think things can zigzag in all kinds of ways, especially again, with this use of violence. So I just wondered how hopeful one can be about the possibilities of the nation state itself becoming a viable instrument in that project. Raphael, I'm sorry if I took longer to make this point, but I thought perhaps it would be helpful if I got this clearer.
Very helpful, thank you.
Great. No, that was a very interesting intervention, a hugely important question, Desmond. Thanks very much. And well, let me say a few things about it. I'm running out of steam already, but I'd like to say a couple of things at least about, beginning with dignity. I think you're absolutely correct. I never thought about it in the way in which you put it. Yes, it is very important not to slip back. There's a lot of slippages between sort of the new narratives of life that emphasize care and communality and territoriality and dignity, and their liberal understanding of those terms. I mean, there's a liberal sense in which of the community. I'm always struck by how easily people invoke the community in the US, where is the quintessential life, the quintessential country of individualism, of decriminalization, radical decriminalization. You want to see it anywhere. You see it in the US, especially among the white middle class. Definitely, yes. So, yes, that's very well taken. When Francia Marquez talks about dignity becoming habit, she's talking about dignity in a collective sense. The dignity of Black peoples, the dignity of the nadies, the dignity of the exploited, the dignity of the indigenous, the dignity of the peasants is always collective, but it's easy to slip back again into an individualist understanding of it. So thanks for that point. Now, is the decolonial thinking, the decolonial thought, prescriptive or descriptive? I think, as most academic theories, it is mostly, I would say then, descriptive, explanatory. It is prescriptive implicitly, but most academics are very wary of jumping into prescription. We're seeing it even now in Colombia, where critical academics on the left say, you know, they're very taking a distance from the new government because they want to maintain their independence. And that's fine up to a certain point, although it's still an individualist sense of independence. And I think that there is a moment at which all of these tools that we have developed in the critical academy, in many ways in conversation with the struggles, need to be put into practice, need to be placed, but how to do it without, again, falling back into reactionary understandings of what we're talking about. And the only criteria that I found in practice, especially in my own work with some of the movements, including the Afro-Colombian movements and environmental movements here, is to do it with as clear as possible an understanding of the political project of those groups with whom we work that we can have. So we have to go beyond this idea that we are observers that can describe objectively, beyond the epistemology and ontology of subjects and objects, of observers and observed. And we really engage in the struggle and contribute to conceptualize and theorize from within. And what I find is that in Latin America, people, activists, are very interested in intellectuals doing that kind of work with them. If they are not coming, if they don't feel that they are coming from the outside, that they are coming from, you know, us to extract their knowledge and experience. So I know that's not a good answer to the question. I'm getting tired now, but I think in the role of the academy, what is the role of the academy in this? Sometimes in my most pessimistic moments, I say that the academy is one of the main occupying forces, ontologically occupying forces of people's experiences and territories. Because the academy provides the categories with the experts, the economists in particular, but also the anthropologists, the geographers, the engineers, the MBAs, go on to colonize people's lives with their categories and institutions. So that, of course, we know there are spaces of contestation within the academy, and that's important. In Latin America, there is a movement to decolonize the academy, for epistemic decolonization, to open up spaces within the academy. And maybe we can apply this into the state. Can the state be decolonized? My almost intuitive answer is like yours. No, it cannot be decolonized. The state is a political technology of modernity. It cannot do other than that. But different regimes within the nation state can provide at least better conditions for people's struggles from below to flourish, if not to flourish, at least not to be crushed, as it's been happening in Latin America since the conquest. That people's resistance and struggles movements are crushed with brutality, as in, for instance, in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, with brutal regimes that kill, massacre the activists and the opposition. So in relation to the state, I think there are two positions that make sense to me. One says that the state is an important institution of society. We need to democratize the state. We need to make the state work for social justice, to work for rights, to work for everybody. But we need to push that position pluriversally in a way, more autonomously, from an autonomous position, and suggest that the state really needs to be pushed into becoming an active force for transitioning away from the modern order that gave rise to the state to something else that we don't know what it's going to be. But yeah, struggling within the state in that sense makes sense strategically up to a certain point. But in the last instance, any significant social change is going to come from below. And that's a discussion that, again, some of my more radical friends in Colombia, they don't want to, even if they voted for the Progressive Coalition, they don't want to have an involvement with that coalition. They want to continue their work at the very grassroots level. Okay.
On this inspiring note, I will thank you once again, Professor Arturo Escobar, for your very engaging, interesting presentation, and for engaging with the questions asked by Vishna, Latsela, Christine, Gabriel, Ni, Desmond. This has been a very amazing session, and I've learned a lot, and I will go back to the video many, many times. Makoni, would you like to make some very brief final comments?
Yes, I can only thank Professor Escobar for this inspiring talk, and I think it leaves us with a lot of inspiration as we try to make dignity a habit, or critical thinking a habit. And I think that should be our aspiration as we move forward. And I must say, let's thank Professor Escobar again, all of us.
Thanks, Sinfui and Chanel, Rafael, Vishnia, everybody else for the invitation. Wonderful conversation.
Now, this is our after party. So